What's up guys, and welcome to this webinar where I will be teaching you what you need to do to make your videos go from this to this using the exact same camera and the exact same lens. All right, let's jump into it. All right guys, we have our subject, we have our camera here, and as you can see, this image does not look very good. Even though we're filming with an expensive cinema camera, this is a terrible image. So the principles that we'll be talking about today can be applied to any camera. You don't have to have an expensive cinema camera like this. And at the very end of this webinar, I'm going to show you what the image looks like, even being shot with an iPhone, to where you can get great cinematic looking shots with an iPhone. So going to our image here with our subject, we can see that this is not professional. This isn't something that looks good. This isn't something that you would see in a Hollywood movie or in a commercial or anything like that. So I'm going to walk you through my 10 steps of how we can make this image look cinematic by using the exact same camera and the exact same lens. So first thing that we notice is that the composition is off. And this is one of the biggest mistakes that I see beginner filmmakers make, is they give their subject too much headroom. So the first rule of thumb is we want to make sure that our subject's eyes are on the very top third of the screen. Because too many filmmakers have their image like this, where they just have way too much headroom. So we can see that it's already starting to look a little bit better, but there's a lot of other things we can do to adjust and fix the composition of the shot. First thing is that we notice that the camera is lower than her eye level. That's a big no-no. You never want to have a camera lower than your eye level, especially if you're just doing an interview or trying to show your subject's face. So the first thing we got to do is we got to raise the camera up to make it either at her eye level or slightly above her eye level, because as you can see here, we can see up her nose. It's just not a flattering image coming from that angle. So try to at least get the camera from eye level or a little bit higher than eye level. So now that you see that the camera is at eye level, it's looking a little bit better, but there's still a lot of things that we can do to make the shot look cinematic. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about depth. Now, a big mistake that I see with beginner filmmakers is whenever they do an interview or they have their subjects like this, they always push them right up against the wall. That looks terrible. You never want your image pushed right up against the wall like this. You want to create depth in your image. So the next step that we're going to do is we're going to try to get her as far away from the wall as possible to create that depth. So now we've separated her from the wall. There's about 4 or 5 feet of distance between her and the wall, so we're starting to create some of that depth. Another thing that we can do to add some more depth is to adjust our focal length. As you can see right here, my lens is zoomed all the way out, which is as wide as possible, and this is a zoom lens, so I can zoom in and out with this lens. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in to make her face look the most flattering. Every lens that you have has different pros and cons. For wide lenses, those are best for getting big landscape shots or big shots of a house or a building, shots of a field, shots of nature. But if you're trying to get a shot of someone's face, you never want to use a wide shot. As you can see here, this is what a face looks like with a wide lens versus a tight lens. So with this lens, we want to zoom in as much as we can to make her face look the most flattering and to also add a little bit more depth into the shot. So instead of being as wide as we can be at 18 millimeters, we're now zoomed into 35 millimeters, and you can see that her face is looking a lot better and a lot more natural, how you would see it with your actual eyes. Next, I want to talk about frame rate, and this is another big mistake that I see beginner filmmakers make. Most beginner filmmakers just choose a random frame rate and shoot in that frame rate, but I'm telling you that it's so important to have the correct frame rate for what you're shooting. For most videos, if you don't want any slow motion in your video, you want to shoot your video at 24 frames per second. As you can see here, I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, which is a big mistake that a lot of filmmakers make. Most movies are shot in 24 frames per second, so that's what our eyes are used to seeing when we want to see cinematic video. So if you're shooting at 30 or 60 frames per second, your video is going to be too smooth and it's not going to look natural and it's not going to look cinematic. So we're going to change our video from 30 frames per second to 24 frames per second or 23.98 frames per second, which is the more properly used term. So you may be asking, well, in what situations would you use those other frame rates? The only other time that you should shoot other than 24 frames per second is if you want slow motion in your video. If you shoot 60 frames per second, you can then slow that footage down in editing and it makes slow motion. The next thing we're going to talk about is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And these are all settings in your camera that affect how your final image will look. So to start off, we can see here that we have our ISO set at 12,800, which is way too high. And as you can see, the image is looking really grainy. So the first thing to know is you always want to keep your ISO as low as it can be so that you don't introduce grain or noise into your footage. Second thing is you want to make your aperture as low as it can be to create depth in the image. Another thing to add with aperture is aperture shows how blurry your background is going to be in comparison to your subject. So right now we see that we have a really high aperture and everything is in focus. Her face is in focus, the wall behind her is also in focus. But as we lower our aperture, we can start to see that the background becomes more blurry, which gives the image more depth, which makes it look more cinematic. So here you can see an example of what the image looks like with a high aperture of an f9 versus a low aperture of an f1.8. So as you can see, the lower aperture makes your image look more cinematic because it creates more depth in the image and makes it look more like a Hollywood movie. And then the third thing is for shooting at 24 frames per second, ideally we'd want a 1/48 shutter speed. Most cameras don't have that option, and the closest thing they have to it is 1/50 shutter speed, so that's what we're going to choose for these settings now. Now the next thing I want to talk about is white balance. As you can see here, we are being lit by these lights up here, which are a little bit more orange than the sun that's outside. So we did not set our white balance correctly, and as you can see, her face looks super orange in this image. It's not natural, it's not what we would see with her eyes. So we need to adjust our white balance to compensate for these orange lights up ahead. So we're gonna go into our white balance, and usually the rule for white balance is if you're filming outdoors, you want your white balance to be around 5600 Kelvin. But if you're filming indoors with these orange lights, you want your white balance to be anywhere from 3000 to 4000 Kelvin. So every time you're adjusting your white balance, you want to make sure that the image that you see on your screen is the same color temperature that you see with your eyes. If your image is more blue or more red than what you're seeing with your eyes, you want to change your white balance to match what you see with your eyes. So now that our white balance is adjusted correctly, you can see that the image is looking a lot better already. But there's still a lot of things that we can do to make this image look more cinematic. And that's why we've brought in this big dome light here to add some more cinematic lighting to her face. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna actually turn off all the indoor lights, and we're gonna use this big dome light and another hair light to backlight her to make it look really cinematic and beautiful. And a lot of filmmakers wonder why you would use such a big dome light as this. And one of the secrets to getting beautiful cinematic lighting is to get soft lighting. Now, in order to get soft lighting, the secret to getting soft light is you want your light source to be as big as possible and as close to your subject as possible. Notice that I said big light source and not bright light source, because brightness has no effect on how hard or soft your lighting is. So with this big dome light, this creates a big light source, and if we bring this as close to her face as possible, it makes a lot of beautiful soft light wrap around her face, which makes it look more aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Soft light always looks best hitting the front of the face. Hard light, on the other hand, looks best being backlit or backlighting someone. That's why if you're shooting outdoors, you always want the sun to be behind your subject. So we're gonna get this dome light and we're gonna bring it as close to her face as possible without being in the shot to make it as soft as it can be. So now we've turned off the lights in the room, we've turned on this dome light, but as you can see, the color temperature of this light is different from the color temperatures of the light in the room. So we now have to go back into our camera settings and adjust the color temperature to match the color temperature of this dome light. This dome light has a daylight color temperature, so we're gonna adjust the color temperature back to 5600 Kelvin. So now we've adjusted our color temperature to 5600 Kelvin, and we can see that the image is now looking amazing. This is a beautiful image. And there's still a couple things we can do to make it look even better. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna bring in a backlight. And what a backlight does is it adds a little bit more depth to your subject, separating them from the background. Another advantage of having a backlight is it can sometimes add a cool lens flare into your image, which can also make it look a little bit more cinematic. So here we have our backlight. We're gonna put this on this stand in just a second, but before we do that, I also wanna show you what it would look like using a hard light like this, lighting her face from the front instead of from the back. Like I said, to make soft lights, you want your light source to be as big as possible and as close to your subject as possible. So in order to make hard light, you want a smaller light source like this. As you can see, the light source is a lot smaller, and the further away you get it from your subject, the harder it will be. So this is what her face looks like with soft light, and this is what her face looks like with hard light. As you can see, there's a lot more harsh shadows on her face, and it doesn't wrap around her face as well as it did with the beautiful soft light. Another tip that you want to do with your soft light is you want to make sure that it's above the eye level. If the light is coming from straight on or from underneath, it's not going to look as flattering. So try to get your light slightly above the eye level of what your subject is at. So make sure that your key light, the soft light, is always higher than the eye level of your subject. All right, with our backlight here, we're going to make make sure that first it's out of the frame because we don't want to see it in the shot. We're going to make sure it's pointed at our camera. And with this specific light, we can adjust the focus beam of it to make it wider or more narrow. We can adjust the brightness to make it brighter or dimmer. So this is the light turned off, and this is the light turned all the way up to 100%, so you can see what that's doing to the image now. So I'm just gonna play with these settings a little bit and get it all dialed in to be the exact way that I want it to be. Now we're gonna turn off our key light to see exactly what the backlight is doing. And that's another really helpful tip when you're filming, is to turn on and off different lights to see exactly what they're doing. So as we turn off our key light, we can see that the backlight is creating a really cool outline of her shoulder and her head, which makes the image look a little bit more cinematic as well. So now we have both of our lights turned on, and this image is almost perfect. There's still a couple things that we're gonna do to this to make it look the best. So the first thing that we notice is that on the sides of the frame, it's not very full. We have a lot of dead space on her left and her right, and so we wanna fill the frame a little bit more. So we're gonna bring in a plant, and then we're also gonna bring in a little bookshelf with a light to make it look a little bit better. So we have brought in this fake plant, and we've brought in this bookshelf with another light on it to make it just look even more beautiful. And now we can see that our image is finished. Look how amazing this looks. This was great because we were able to cover up the white outlet with the plant. And as you can see on the left side of the screen, we have this orange looking light, which just adds a little bit of color, makes the image pop a little bit more. It just makes it look really vibrant and beautiful. So you may be wondering, well, that's all great, but Nick, that's shot with a $35,000 cinema camera. Well, I'm gonna take my iPhone now, I'm gonna get the same image to show you that the equipment doesn't matter as much as your skill level. So I'm gonna turn on my iPhone camera and show you what it looks like with that now. So this is the image being shot with my iPhone, and it still looks amazing and beautiful and cinematic. So you can see that the gear doesn't nearly matter as much as your talent and your skill as a filmmaker. So as you can see, our image is looking really good, and it really doesn't matter what camera we use, the image still looks great no matter what camera you're shooting with. But there's still a couple things we can do to make this look even better. So now I'm gonna take you to the editing room, and with color grading, I'm gonna show you how you can make this image look even better. So I'm gonna take you there now. We are now in the editing room. We have Premiere Pro opened up, and the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna add a LUT onto this clip. So we're gonna add on the Avium LUT, which is a free LUT that you get when you actually purchase the Pro Filmmaker course. And as you can tell, that LUT already does so much just by itself. This is before and this is after the LUT, so it makes a huge difference already. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go into our basic correction tab. We're gonna increase the contrast a little bit, increase the highlights, but not too much because we never want our skin tones to be white. So we'll increase it just enough to where the skin tones just pop a little bit but don't look white. We'll increase the shadows just a touch. We're actually gonna crush the blacks just a little bit. We don't wanna crush them too much or else it'll look terrible, but we're gonna take the blacks down just a little bit, just like that. Then to finish it off, we're gonna go into our color wheels and match, and we're gonna add a little bit of blue into our shadows here, and you can tell that that makes the image look so good, adding just a touch of blue into the shadows. And then to contrast that, we're gonna add just a little bit of orange into the highlights. So this is what it looks like before and after, adding the blues into the shadows and the oranges into the highlights. This is a very stylized look that they use for a lot of Hollywood movies, and this is a look that I absolutely love and I use on almost all of my videos. And now our final image is complete.